adopted in 1948 and every day since. Championed for universal human rights since well before the Declaration was adopted in 1948 and every day since. Secretary of State Mike Pompeo has dedicated much of his tenure at the State Department to re-energizing the global commitment to human rights and giving voice to those around the world who are denied their human dignity. In May of last year, the Department of State announced the creation of the Commission on Unalienable Rights, designed to provide advice and recommendations to the Secretary on international human rights matters. In its deliberations and final report, the Commission necessarily focused considerable attention on the Universal Declaration and noted that the political ideals and traditions of the United States were central to its development. The decision to focus on the Universal Declaration during this year's high-level week reflects the Trump administration's deep commitment to human rights around the world, a focus on the fundamental nature of those rights, as well as the recognition that the United Nations has not always proven a successful defender of them. As we all know, the UN is a reflection of its membership, and on human rights matters, far too many member states fall short of their commitments to the Universal Declaration. And so, it has never been more important for the responsible nations of the world to return to their commitments made through the Universal Declaration and give renewed emphasis to human rights in everything the UN does. I want to thank Secretary Pompeo for his leadership on these issues and for his moral clarity that he brings to his work every day. With that, Mr. Secretary, the floor is yours.
Good morning, and thank you, Ambassador Kraft. The United States is lucky to have a UN ambassador who is such a stalwart champion of human rights, the cause that brings us together here today. The horrors of the Second World War made clear the duty of every sovereign nation to protect the dignity of all human beings. And so, in 1948, the United Nations General Assembly approved the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. The UDHR's the first line reads as follows: recognition of the inherent dignity and of the equal and inalienable rights of all members of the human family is the foundation of freedom, justice, and peace in the world. Those words echo America's Declaration of Independence, which states that the purpose of our government is to secure unalienable rights, the rights inherent in all persons. The UDHR also drew on the wisdom of the Abrahamic faiths, Confucianism, Hinduism, and other religious, philosophical, and political traditions. We must defend unalienable rights today, depriving our fellow human beings of their basic rights. Meanwhile, many multinational organizations have lost their way, focusing on partisan political rights. That often conflict. To uphold universal human rights, we should look to the framers of the UDHR, who identified a clear set of principles that apply to all people, everywhere, and at all times. They stood unwaveringly in defense of the dignity of every human being. And so, too, should we. To help us do that, I convened the U.S. State Department's Commission on Unalienable Rights. The Commission found in the American constitutional tradition wide and deep support for unalienable rights. We hope the Commission's recently published report will serve as an inspiration to other nations and to peoples all across the world. They should turn to their traditions and rededicate themselves to their moral, philosophical, and religious resources to affirm the rights inherent in all persons, the rights at the core of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. This work is vital. We must rediscover the nature of human rights, and we must have the courage to defend them. Your presence here today gives me great confidence that we're up to that task. Thank you again, Ambassador Kraft, for convening us. May God bless you all.
Good morning, everybody. My name is Robert Destro. I am the Assistant Secretary here at the State Department for Democracy, Human Rights, and Labor. And I'd like to welcome you to this conversation about the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and the panel conversation we're about to have. I'd like to begin by thanking Secretary Pompeo and Ambassador Kraft for kicking off this conversation today. And I'd like to especially thank Secretary Pompeo for starting the conversation within the State Department on the fundamental principles that guide our understanding of human rights. As I begin the panel discussion today, I'd like to make a couple of preliminary comments, and that is, what it is we're about to do this morning, to talk about the culture of human rights. And we must consider in our discussions that there are many problems around the world. As Assistant Secretary for Human Rights, Democracy, and Labor, I have to deal with these problems on a daily basis. And so what we need to do is remember that every legal culture around the world has its fundamental words and its fundamental concepts. And so when we talk about our commitments to human rights, we're locating ourselves in particular outlooks on these issues. So this morning, I'm very pleased to be joined by three distinguished legal scholars from the Confucian, Islamic, and Western traditions. So let me begin by introducing them briefly. The learned hand professor of law emerita at Harvard University and a former ambassador to the U.S. ambassador to the Holy See. And I might add the leading American expert on the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. She is the author of I think the definitive book on the Universal Declaration, A World Made New, Eleanor Roosevelt and the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. It was published in 2001. I'd also like to introduce my colleague, Pak Yahya. Haji Yahya Cholil Staquf is a distinguished Muslim scholar and the co-founder of a global movement, Humanitarian Islam, that seeks to reform obsolete tenets of Islamic orthodoxy that enjoin religious hatred, supremacy, and violence by as General Secretary of Indonesia's Nahdlatul Ulama, the world's largest Muslim organization. It has over 50 million members and 14,000 madrasas. Imam Staquf is bringing the civilizational wisdom and spiritual authority where a harsh and repressive and all too often violent understanding of Islam has predominated for decades. And then lastly, and certainly I'm very thrilled to have Mr. Hu Ping, a political philosopher in the Confucian tradition and a writer. He received his master's degree in philosophy from Beijing University. In 1971, he was a participant, 1979, I'm sorry. Mr. Hu Ping was a participant in the Zindan Democracy Wall movement in the Nanyang district of Peking University. In January 1987, he came to the United States to pursue a doctoral degree at Harvard, and he has served as a chief editor. He served as a board member of Human Rights in China and as the president for China's democratic transition. His books are fascinating, and I commend them to you. And so now let me begin by raising some questions for our panelists, and I'm with Pak Yahya, if you don't mind, and would like to ask you if the line with the aspirations of Islam.
Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh, Pak Bob Destro. Selamat pagi semuanya. Terima kasih telah mengundang saya di dalam forum ini. Jadi Islam dibawa oleh Nabi Muhammad SAW sebagai agama dengan mengemban aspirasi peradaban, yaitu apa yang dianggap aspirasi peradaban itu adalah pertama jelas ketuhanan, dan kedua memuliakan manusia, dignifying human beings, dan ketiga rahmah, compassion yang mendasar yang dibawa oleh Islam. Kita bisa melihat dengan jelas sekali bahwa aspirasi peradaban itu telah tertampung sepenuhnya di dalam melihat kemudian bahwa di dalam perjalanan sejarah terjadi pergulatan yang sangat dinamis yang diwarnai oleh pertama kebutuhan untuk mengabadikan aspirasi peradaban itu tantangan realistis, dan pergulatan itu seringkali kemudian menghasilkan hal-hal, lembaga-lembaga, ekspresi-ekspresi yang mungkin tidak ideal, tetapi harus selalu diingat bahwa cita-cita mendasar yang harus dituju, yang harus dicapai adalah saatnya seluruh umat manusia sungguh-sungguh memperhatikan kebutuhan untuk menerima prinsip-prinsip yang ada di dalam Universal Declaration of Human Rights ini di satu era berproses bersama untuk yang tidak terpisah-pisah satu sama lain, yang harmonis untuk semua orang. Seluruh umat manusia harus punya satu nilai bersama yang diterima sebagai konsensus, sebagai dasar hidup berdampingan secara damai dan harmonis. Dan nilai-nilai tentang hak asasi manusia ini adalah nilai yang mutlak tidak boleh dikeluarkan dari konsensus bersama di dalam peradaban global di masa depan.
Divorced from global civilization in the future.
Thank you very much for those comments. And let me now turn to Mr. Hu Ping. And if you would address the question, some people say that the concept from the Chinese perspective, how would you react to that?
人权当然是名叫张公孙的中国学者，不少来自基督教传统的国家的代表，主张就像美国的独立宣言那样，把人权表述为人人被造而成的造物主赋予他们若干不可剥夺的权利，相同平等。他们富有可以适用于各种非基督教传统的国家，更好地体现了人权的普适性，因此得到广泛的赞同，写进了世界人权宣言的文本。所谓普世价值呢，有两层意思。一是说这种价值具有普遍适用性，不分宗教、国家和民族都适用。另一层意思是说，这种价值在大多数地方被很多人共同发现和认同。哪怕这种发现还比较模糊，缺少很准确、明确的准确清晰的表达，哪怕这种认同还没有表现在外部行为上，没有体现在制度性的安排上。我们就拿第一人权、言论自由作为例子，在中国古代， He who speaks his mind commits no sin, made of white jade on each side of the gate of heavenly peace, which is in front of the forbidden city. As symbols, they replace the wood columns used in the ancient imperial courts of the famed emperors of Yao and Shen. Legend has it that these columns were placed there by the sides of main roads so the people could post their opinions, including criticisms of the emperors. However, these columns eventually lost their functionality and became merely objects of decoration. So even though we might not have the words for human rights or freedom, but it doesn't really mean that the Chinese people were indifferent to human rights or freedom or did not decipher them. Some Chinese terms or can be said as discovery and invention. Discovery because it is not from nowhere or baseless. In this case, it reflects a certain sentiment or desire that we always have. Our sentiment or desire for when the Chinese people are born immediately to that. And they say, that's it. But in Washington, D.C., there is a granite by a Qing Dynasty Mandarin and student on Confucius by the name of Xi Jinping, in which he bestows the highest compliments on President Washington. He wrote in this article that the system created by the American founding fathers had almost reached the heights of the ancient Chinese ideal in which the world belongs to all and all serve each other. This is known as the ideal state, exemplified by the three ancient Chinese dynasties. 108 years ago, China founded the very first republic in Asia, the Republic of China. Today, Taiwan maintains an excellent record of human rights and freedom. At the same time, it preserves Chinese culture.
Well, thank you so much, the Universal Professor Glendon and in the UDHR and
distinguished colleagues who dedication to the principles of the UDHR and what specifically was contributed by the United States prompts me to observe first that this 75th anniversary to reflect on for the members of the already diverse UN in 1948, contentious in 1948, agreement on a few basic principles that in fact transformed the moral terrain of international relations. And the future of human rights is or is not, and say, how is it possible that in this already diverse 58-member United Nations, how is it possible that they approved the UDHR without a single dissenting vote? And in my view, three factors stand out that made that possible. And one was that the list of principles in the UDHR was kept very long to men and women simply by virtue of being human. Another factor relevant to the question of Westernness is that the UDHR was preceded by a study commissioned by UNESCO that gathered together thinkers, and they found, somewhat to their own surprise, in the world's ideas about human decency. And the third factor was that armed with that study, the actual framers of the UDHR collaboration. Among the most influential were the Chinese Confucian scholar already mentioned, Peng Chongjiang, Charles Malik, who was the chief spokesman for the Arab League at the time, and who cooperated with the French and sought with her not only the US tradition, which was highly convergent with the principles of administration under which she served, to the idea so beautifully expressed in the UN Charter and in the university. The fact that agreement was achieved at a time when the world was in great turmoil, as it is now, is a fact that should give us hope for the future. And it prompts me to suggest, Mr. Secretary, that it would be helpful for the press what Secretary Pompeo asked the US Commission on Unalienable Rights to do, and that is what they did of a rights tradition that drew on a biblical inheritance, that drew on an English inheritance of freedom, and that drew Secretary Pompeo suggested that the work of our commission could help to strengthen, I'm quoting his language here, the intellectual defense of the principles of the great post-World War II human rights project. Similar exercise. Thank you.
And you raise a very, very interesting point about intercultural collaboration. And that, I'll make a few more comments about that toward the end. But let me go back to Yahya for a moment. And we've talked about intercultural collaboration, and we've talked about whether or not the principles, but if the fundamental aspirations of Islam and those of the UDH are in alignment, why was the Cairo Declaration of Human Rights in Islam written and presented?
Ya, saya seperti telah disampaikan tadi bahwa
as I said earlier,
UDHR ini disebut universal bukan hanya karena kita membutuhkan satu konsensus universal dan prinsip-prinsip hak asasi manusia, tapi karena memang di dalam realitas, memang di dalam kenyataannya, apa yang ada di dalam UDHR ini bisa diterima oleh semua budaya. Tahun 90-an kemudian muncul deklarasi Kairo. Menurut saya ini dikarenakan masih adanya persepsi ada dunia Islam yang terpisah dari dunia Barat yang berada dalam hubungan persaingan atau bahkan konflik. Ini saya kira bisa dimengerti karena dunia cukup awal di dalam sejarah Islam sampai dengan abad ke-20 bahwa hubungan antara dunia Islam dengan dunia Barat memang sangat problematik. Ada konflik berkepanjangan sedemikian rupa sehingga persepsi ini mengendap di dalam kesadaran banyak umat Islam di dunia. Saya kira lahirnya deklarasi Kairo itu dilatar belakangi oleh persepsi semacam ini. Walaupun sebetulnya kalau kita baca isi dari deklarasi Kairo tidak ada yang secara substansial bertentangan Kairo itu pun sebetulnya. Nah, hanya saja deklarasi Kairo itu untuk melestarikan sejumlah nilai-nilai yang dimatangkan di dalam jurisprudensi Islam. Nah, menurut saya pertama bahwa umat Islam sekarang tidak bisa lagi meneruskan persepsi tentang pemilahan peradaban seperti yang dimiliki pada masa lalu. Kita mau tidak mau harus semua umat manusia mau tidak mau harus berintegrasi satu sama lain secara damai dan harmonis. Dan untuk itu maka suatu shared civilisasi sama. Nah, dulu di dalam sejarah Islam sempat muncul dan dimapankan sejumlah jurisprudensi yang apabila dipaksakan untuk terus diterapkan relevan. Misalnya, kita harus akui bahwa pada masa lalu ada jurisprudensi di dalam wacana keislaman yang berisikan norma-norma realitas kesejarahan yang melingkupi lahirnya jurisprudensi tersebut. Sekarang, konteks realitas telah berubah. Hubungan yang problematik yang cenderung bersifat konfliktual antara dunia Islam dengan peradaban yang lain, termasuk peradaban Kristen Eropa atau Barat, sekarang tidak bisa lagi kita teruskan. Oleh karena itu, jurisprudensi yang masih mengandung norma-norma diskriminatif ini harus dikontekstualisasi yang mapan selama ini. Pada awal tahun 2019 yang lalu dalam satu pertemuan nasional para ulama yang dinyatakan bahwa dalam konteks realitas negara bangsa modern ini adalah penegasan yang bersifat jurisprudensi tentang satu norma yang harus kita terima bersama sekarang. Walaupun sebetulnya sejak awal berdirinya negara Republik Indonesia, nilai tentang kesetaraan hak, tentang persamaan derajat di antara berbagai kelompok yang berbeda-beda, baik secara etnis, ulama, prinsip baru untuk di dalam jurisprudensi Islam terkait contoh dunia Islam sungguh-sungguh berintegrasi dengan seluruh umat manusia lainnya tanpa ada sekat-sekat, karena ini akan menjadi kenyataan peradaban seluruh umat manusia, akan menjadi sumber masalah yang luar biasa bagi seluruh kemanusiaan. Maka integrasi konsensus atas yang tentang martabat manusia, prinsip-prinsip penghormatan atas hak-hak asasi manusia. Tidak bisa untuk menolak prinsip-prinsip tentang hak asasi manusia ini dengan dalih karena memegangi keunikan kulturalnya sendiri. Karena betapapun juga tidak ada lagi komunitas manusia yang akan bisa mengisolasi diri.
Thank you. Thank you very much. The ways in which to Mr. Huping again and address the one of the basic divisions in the Universal Declaration of Rights on one hand and economic categories there, as
I would say that only rights in the first category are human rights in the fundamental sense. Rights in the second category are actually human welfare benefits. And because the former are inherent to human beings and they can be attained naturally so long as the government does not bar to suppress them. Whereas the fulfillment of the latter requires active government intervention and action. I, of course, am not opposed to government providing necessary welfare, but I disagree on confusing just a matter of we will think the United States cannot be set free of flaws, and China cannot be set short of achievements. So the difference in this regard would only be a matter of degree. However, the United States has freedom of speech, and China does not. This country that respects and protects human rights, whereas China is a country that disregards and tramples on human rights. I put particular emphasis on basic human rights, that is, rights that are innate and unalienable to a peasant, such as freedom of speech. Many of my friends actually came from mainland China and have been granted political and fresh civil rights, such as the political rights. They are the authoritarian China.
Well, thank you, London. That the distinction between political compromise, we look to what we're doing today, and if so, how do we apply it in a way that would prompt countries?
One thing to notice is that the Universal Declaration was far ahead of its time, but we can say that after 70 years, 72 years, it remains the principal common standard by which nearly every nation has agreed to be judged. After 70 years, 72 years, there is hardly any flagrant or repeated instance of a serious human rights violation that has escaped publicity. And in fact, most governments now go to great lengths to avoid being blacklisted as notorious violators. But there is still much, and the most serious problem right now, in my view, is that the consensus on which the whole post-World War II human rights idea rested and still rests, it was a fragile consensus in the beginning, and it's more fragile than ever now because there are some powerful nations that are actually endeavoring to undermine that consensus. Yet millions of men and women now, as then, millions around the world, less relevant. It's made it more at the beginning of our discussions today. This is no time for responsible nations to weaken in their defense of human rights, their promotion of human rights, and their protection of universal human rights.
Weaken. And you may, department have been trying is to through other Muslim organizations and getting control of some of the bad behaviors we see around the world in both the Muslim and the non-Muslim world, and among the different faith traditions that we see around the world, not just Christianity, Judaism, and Islam, but the Buddhist tradition, the Confucian tradition, and others.
Ya, saya ingin menggarisbawahi apa yang disampaikan oleh Profesor Clinton tadi bahwa UDHR ini adalah cita-cita ideal yang harus kita perjuangkan ke depan. Mungkin tidak ada satupun negara sekarang ini yang sudah sempurna menerapkan prinsip-prinsip yang ada di dalam UDHR ini, karena ini adalah cita-cita yang harus kita capai ke depan. Ini sama dengan apa yang saya sebut sebagai aspirasi peradaban Islam itu. Umat Islam sepanjang sejarah harus terus bergulat untuk mencapai, mewujudkan apa yang menjadi aspirasi mulia dari Islam untuk peradaban umat manusia. Sama seperti ketika Amerika Serikat didirikan dan ditetapkan konstitusi Amerika Serikat itu sebagai aspirasi peradaban Amerika yang ideal untuk Amerika. Demikian juga Indonesia ketika menyatakan kemerdekaan dan menetapkan oleh bangsa Indonesia. Kita tahu bahwa tidak langsung sejak cita-cita itu ditetapkan, kemudian kita bisa langsung mewujudkan. Perlu pergulatan yang panjang secara terus-menerus dan seringkali harus menghadapi keadaan-keadaan yang sangat jelek. Tetapi cita-cita awal ini, aspirasi awal yang mendasar itu tidak boleh dilupakan. Walaupun misalnya di satu masa yang panjang sekali itu bisa dilihat di dalam kenyataan, tapi perjuangan harus terus dilakukan. Walaupun misalnya tidak di Amerika sebenarnya dihapuskan perbudakan, harus menunggu sekian lama sampai ada Abraham Lincoln, dan sudah itu harus melalui perjalanan. Tidak langsung setelah konstitusi Indonesia ditetapkan, kemudian cita-cita yang ada di situ terwujud. Kami harus melalui pergulatan sampai sekarang, dan saya harus katakan bahwa sampai sekarang pun bangsa Indonesia belum berhasil mencapai cita-cita sebagaimana ditetapkan di dalam konstitusi kami. Nah, maka sebetulnya yang kita butuhkan sekarang, mengingat bahwa seluruh umat manusia ini nanti akan masuk dalam era menuju peradaban tunggal untuk seluruh dunia yang dihidupi bersama oleh seluruh umat manusia. Maka sebetulnya kerjasama antara dunia Islam dengan dunia Barat misalnya, dengan Cina, dengan India, dan lain sebagainya, ini satu hal yang tidak terelakkan, tidak bisa dihindari, dan harus dilakukan. Nah, saya hanya ingin menyebut beberapa prinsip dalam hal ini, bahwa pertama, kerjasama itu harus lebih dari sekedar kesepakatan-kesepakatan pada tingkat pemerintahan negara-negara. Karena yang kita butuhkan adalah internalisasi nilai-nilai di dalam masyarakat, agar nilai-nilai itu menjadi budaya, agar konsensus tentang aspirasi nilai-nilai mulia, termasuk di dalamnya hak asasi manusia ini, betul-betul diinternalisasi oleh masyarakat. kemudian dihidupi oleh masyarakat, sehingga masyarakat ini nantilah yang akan, karena mereka menginternalisasi nilai-nilai mulia itu, mereka akan terus-menerus melakukan kontrol kepada berbagai penguasa politik, aktor politik, untuk juga melayani aspirasi nilai-nilai mulia ini secara berkelanjutan. Nah, maka kita membutuhkan satu kerjasama yang bisa menembus langsung sampai ke grassroots, ke tingkat masyarakat. Kita membutuhkan konsensus di tingkat masyarakat, satu societal consensus, bukan hanya political consensus di antara pemerintahan negara-negara saja. Nah, itu berarti kita perlu melibatkan berbagai macam aktor di kalangan masyarakat sipil, organisasi-organisasi masyarakat, untuk bisa diberi peran di dalam perjuangan bersama untuk menegakkan nilai-nilai hak asasi manusia ini yang sebetulnya ini menjadi aspirasi dari seluruh umat manusia. Seluruh umat manusia ingin menjadi manusia yang bermartabat, yang mulia, yang bebas, yang dihormati hak-haknya. Maka semua orang yang berkehendak baik ini perlu bergabung dalam konsensus untuk mewujudkannya, dalam perjuangan untuk mewujudkannya. Nah, sekarang ini kita mewarisi sejumlah masalah yang bisa menjadi hambatan, bahkan menjadi ancaman yang berbahaya. Misalnya, pertama, kita mewarisi satu kebiasaan untuk menjadikan agama sebagai alat politik untuk menyerang lawan. Kalau kita lihat konflik-konflik yang terjadi di berbagai belahan dunia ini, banyak diantaranya, mungkin sebagian besar diantaranya, dipicu oleh pihak-pihak yang menjadikan agama sebagai senjata politik untuk menyerang pihak lain. Yang kedua, kita sekarang ini sebagai senjata politik. Keluhan grievances yang dialami oleh satu komunitas di masa lalu di dalam sejarah, kemudian menagih pembalasan kepada pihak yang dulu dianggap menjadi penyebab adanya grievances itu. Nah, ini hal umat manusia ini mengalami sejarah begitu panjang, penuh dengan masalah, sehingga mungkin seperti masa lalu. Sekarang kita sudah ada di dalam kondisi seperti yang kita punyai hari ini. Kita tahu bahwa kita harus mencapai cita-cita ideal bersama, maka mari kita lihat secara jujur apa. Pertama-tama jelas jujur mengakui adanya masalah-masalah yang ada. Kalau masalah tidak diakui dengan jujur, kita tidak mungkin bisa memikirkan jalan keluar.
Very good. Thank you very much. We're just about out of time here, and so I want to turn to our other two panelists quickly for a wrap-up. The question that Professor Glendon raised early was to get other countries to rededicate themselves to the principles of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. What I'd like to ask first, Mr. Hu Ping, and then Professor, and in particular for Mr. Hu Ping, for those who speak to the Chinese people who live not only around the world, but also in both mainland China and Taiwan. Mr. Hu Ping first, and then Professor Glendon.
我想在今天的中国，中国大陆
in today's China, that is mainland China, the human rights have seen great suffering. I would say that here, so I would urge people to understand the universal nature of human rights. Well, why they are universal? I would say that because they are based on a self-evident proposition. Because no one president in any country, like the government that is
peremptory or does not like criticism, or anyone in any country would like the government that he or she will be put in jail or even killed just because they're critical of the government, or any people in any country would like their opportunity of defending themselves in the public when being arrested or tried by the government taken away. So I would say, though, that we would have to uphold the very basic right to freedom of speech. Well, I'm not saying that the Chinese government should do something. I would rather say that the Chinese government not to do something. That is, when people are critical of the government, that the government should refrain itself from arresting or punishing these people, or even killing them. And that's good enough for me. So in the past, we have seen great disasters as a result of such oppression by the government. So I would say that we have to uphold freedom of speech at any given time. This is something we should do.
Thank you. Professor Glendon?
Thank you. I think I'd like to close by recalling the hopes of the framers of the UDHR, that the common standard, the very abstract common standard set by that document, would inspire a kind of competition in excellence among the member nations. And that would give us a kind of a collection of examples of the different ways in which that common standard and those very abstract principles could be brought to life within different cultures and traditions. Examples of how well each country, if it was giving itself a report card, how well each country was progressing in the aim of providing better standards of life in larger freedom for its citizens. It's good to remember that human rights, after all, are just words on paper unless they are brought to life within rights-respecting cultures, protected by laws and institutions. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Glendon, and thank you to Pak Yahya and Mr. Hu Ping. We really do thank you for your participation today. And you've really brought to life the conversation that I know Secretary Pompeo wanted to start around the world with respect to the principles that on which the Universal Declaration of Human Rights is based. I'd like to thank the 57 member states so far that have signed on to our joint statement calling on all nations to recommit themselves to the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. That statement can be found on the United States UN website, as can the list of countries that has signed on so far. We hope that other countries will join, and I can commit certainly to continuing this conversation over the next few months. We at the State Department will be engaging with scholars and human rights advocates from a number of other traditions and cultures, including Judaism, Buddhism, Shia Islam, humanist, and many others. This is a conversation that needs to go on, and if I can point out to in my wrap up to point out that we have a lot of problems out there to solve. This discussion is very useful. We have some very, very interesting challenges. The use of artificial intelligence, for example, to manipulate people's freedom of speech. So there's many, many issues out there, many, many challenges, and we thank you all today for your attention. We thank you for listening in, and that we hope that you will engage with us in a continued discussion about the principles undergirding the